Hello and welcome back to this video. And today I'm going to continue with this mini series on focus. And I'm going to continue with a different subject, but again, with the same relationship towards focus. And I'm going to discuss the automatic bias. Now, I'm going to start with a question. Have you ever heard of the Occam's razor? That idea that the simplest answer tends to be the correct one. And how about this phrase that this is like riding a bike? It literally means that once you learn something, it becomes like a second nature, and that you can perform the same skill even if you haven't practiced that skill in weeks, months, or even years. So think about, for example, driving a car or tying your shoelaces. That's something that hopefully you won't have to think about it every single time that you perform them. Why is that? Why is that idea that there's certain things that I can just learn very quickly, and that skill or that movement or whatever it is that you're learning, why is it that there's certain things that you can learn and then you can just remember them, even again if you haven't practiced them in a very long time? Well, the answer is very simple. It's that concept of automatization. And before you jump here and then you think, well, I heard of automation and automation bias, I'm going to clarify that I'm going to deal with that later, but so far, I'm going to continue to use this concept of automatization. And sometimes it's used as a synonym, or they both are used as synonyms. But I want to clarify that there's some nuances between one and the other one, although we're going to study them together. So from an evolutionary point of view, our ancestors couldn't afford to just learn everything every single time that they have to do that, perform anything from scratch. Like they didn't have the capacity, or they couldn't afford, in the sense that they already had to survive. They couldn't afford to learn every single thing that they did from scratch every single time that they did it. So they relied on their capacity to learn not only from their own experiences, but the experiences of other people. Now, our encephalus, and this is like a fancy way of saying the brain, and this is literally what is inside of your skull. And why I'm going to introduce the word is because I want you to think that when you normally think about the brain, and hopefully you have an image of the brain, it's probably the forebrain, which is a portion. But the encephalus is everything that is, again, inside of the skull. Now, our encephalus, again, this is the fancy way of saying brain, evolved in a way to automate certain processes, again, just to be able to make our learning easier and to be able to continue to evolve. Unfortunately, that level of automatization that I was discussing before, that idea that you can learn something for a little bit and then perform that skill even years after you have finished or you haven't practiced, is mostly related to physical movement. And it involves a portion of the brain called the cerebellum, or the little brain. So just so if you remember, for our fist/brain, so if this is the front, this is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, this will be the temporal lobe, and this will be the occipital lobe on the back of the head, right? So right below and back towards the that portion, in this case the occipital lobe, you would encounter a different portion of the brain called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum, again, little brain, is in charge, among other things, on about coordinating movement and physical movement and preparedness of the movement. So just to make it a little bit easier and to summarize what I'm about to say, let's say that you want to learn a particular dance, right? So you look at someone that is performing a dance, and it's kind of like, all right, I kind of understand those moves, but I don't know, and then I have to figure out how to do them. So the first thing that you're trying to do through your visual cortex, again, on the occipital lobe, on the back of your brain, is recognizing the visual cues, like recognizing what the other person is doing. Maybe it's moving the foot first, then the hip right after, twisting towards one side. All of that is, again, recognized by the visual cortex. And that is one portion, but then you have the other side, which is like, okay, now that you recognize that, you're trying to do the same movements. How do you do them? Obviously, you need to activate your muscles in the same order. So for that, you have two different portions. One is a parietal lobe, and that is where we have all the superior control of the muscles. And again, I'm going to stop here for a second. Every time you move, your leg is not voluntary, is not conscious. In fact, you probably have heard of these. When you go to the doctor and they test your reflex, they hit, for example, your knee and your knee extend. So the reflex actually don't require your brain to perform the movement. In fact, it's a reflex because it goes directly to your spinal cord, and from the spinal cord, it goes back to your muscles, and that's the way in which you activate that movement, right? But when we're talking about and discussing about voluntary movement, you have to engage the brain, and in this case, it's the parietal lobe that I was discussing before, and you're going to activate the right muscles in the right order. But in order for you to do that, the order is actually coordinated not only for the parietal lobe, but for and by the cerebellum, which is the portion of the brain that I was discussing just a couple of minutes ago. And it's not the only function. It actually does different things, obviously more than what I'm about to discuss, but just so you have an idea, it coordinates the movement, but also it kind of calibrates the moves. So think about you not only moving, but testing if you're doing something correctly, meaning are you moving your leg correctly? Does this feel awkward? Does this feel okay? Does it feel natural? So this calibration is actually done by the cerebellum. Now, once established those moves, again, in the paths that create those moves, visual cortex recognizing the movements on other people performing those dance or that dance. Then the parietal lobe making the movements and coordinated by the cerebellum. All of that creates a circuit that we have discussed in the past, the neural paths that are connecting all the different areas. Once established those moves in the right order and with repetition, a pattern is established, and a pattern that will become easier and easier to perform every time it's repeated. And we kind of understand that because we have done that our entire lives. We don't even stop and think about why, but why? Why that happen? Why is it that something becomes easier every time that you perform? Why is it that you don't have a blank canvas every single time that you experience something? Well, in these cases, because, and I'm always thinking about something visual that I can explain, an example that I can use to make it easier. And I always try to explain it in the same manner because I think it's very simple. So let's say that you go to a beach, you're sitting down on the sand, and then you're trying to trace a straight line. So you get a stick, and then you try to trace a line. So the first time that you're going to try that, it's going to be fairly hard, right? Because the stick is trying to move anywhere, and then you have to kind of coordinate. And unless you're super, super slow, the moment that you're trying to do that, you're going to realize that the stick is moving in different places. You're kind of calibrating your movement, right? The same as I was saying before, calibrating with the dance, that is portion of the cerebellum. And at the same time, you're looking through your visual cortex and looking how you're tracing, and then you're making those movements through the parietal lobe. So now, every time you do those moves, you're going to realize that the second time it's becoming a little bit easier. Why? Because among other things, you already have a line that you can guide yourself through. And the third time, even easier, fourth time, and so on. If you do the same thing 50 times, it's not only that it's going to become easier, it's that it's actually difficult for you to do anything else than that. Why? Because in this case, visualize the sand, now doing the same line 50 times, the line will be so deep that it's going to be difficult for you to do anything else. In fact, once you put the stick, you can just trace the line straight because that is already pretty much deep enough that you basically don't have to do anything else or even think about it. Now, something similar happens to our brain when we repeat a pattern over and over again. The pattern is represented in our brain. Our group of neurons, as I was discussing before, the group of neurons between the visual cortex that can recognize the movements, the parietal lobe that is going to send the information to the right muscles, and the cerebellum coordinating everything. That pattern is, again, it's a group of neurons that are connected, multiple groups of neurons that are connected with each other, create this path, and they form what we call the neural circuit. And the more this pattern is repeated, the more we strengthen this neural path. And Not always. I'm going to clarify in a second because I was talking. I want to clarify that we understand this. Emotions and focus play an important role. In fact, if you, for example, have a bad experience, let's say that you're eating something, you're preparing food, you're very excited, and then you eat it, and the moment that you eat it, you start vomiting. Probably the next time you're trying to prepare the same meal, you're starting to feel kind of like sick, or you might actually feel the same feelings that you felt before, because again, now there's an emotional strong association between you preparing that particular food and you vomiting. So again, that will be an example, or an extreme example, in which something doesn't actually require that many times in order for you to kind of like evoke the same response. And also the focus is on the other extreme, because and you probably have experienced this, if you are trying to read, for example, or study, and there are plenty of people around you, there's a lot of noise and you cannot focus, chances are that you're going to be reading that for like 1 hour, 2 hours, you're not going to retain that information. So again, those are two extreme situations in which technically just a repetition by itself is not a condition for success in either or, meaning not because you're repeating that many times is going to be better, because again, if there's external conditions that make you not paying attention or enough attention, then you're not going to remember, or you're not going to retain the information. And on the opposite extreme, if something traumatic happens at that time, you're going to remember that better. I'm not suggesting that you should study and being scared at the same time. I'm just saying that that is actually a condition. Now, but in general, we will say, again, in general, that the more a neural circuit or a neural path is repeated or is reinforced, the easier it will be to replicate the same answer. So again, if you're trying to learn a skill, the more you replicate the same skill, the easier it will become for you to perform the same skill. And as the example that I just gave you with the send, the easier will be for you to repeat the entire sequence without actually thinking, and the harder will be, once activated, to do anything else. Like, you probably, if you have let me give you an example. If you have a particular way to go into your office, let's say, and you have done that for years and years or years, and then all of a sudden one day it changes, then obviously that's going to be shocking. It's going to be like, it's going to caught you off guard. So that phenomenon of reacting differently and then having to change is pretty much what I was discussing. Like, obviously, once you start, you probably are going to do the same thing, but if it stopped at any point, then you're going to kind of like not understand what's happening. You would have to rethink the way that you're doing that task. Now, this is not only about patterns of movements, meaning that idea of automatization, although I explained before that that level of automatization that requires you very little and then you can replicate years and years later without training, unfortunately, is related to physical movement. But the concept itself of automatization is not exclusive of, it's not an exclusive domain of physical movement. It has to do with any pattern that is repeated, and even complex one. And again, let me give you the same example. Think about the route you follow when you go to work. If you're doing the same route over and over again for years, obviously that's going to be very easy for you to replicate. Like, you're going on autopilot. That means that the moment that you start the driving, meaning could be on your car, could be that the trigger is like leaving your parking spot. The moment that you start, you probably already are kind of going into an autopilot, in the sense that you don't have to think about every single thing, right? Or think about, for example, a particular way in which you prepare a sandwich or a soup. These are processes that have been automatized. The benefit of all of these, the automatization, is clear. You don't have to spend so much time thinking every single time that you do something or everything that you do. And the downside of automatization is also very clear, is that the system only works if the conditions are the same. For example, with the example that I was giving you about the route, if the conditions change one day and then all of a sudden there's an accident or there's construction and you cannot continue, obviously you can't just do it. You cannot continue with the same route that you have always done, like you would have to look for a separate route. So now remember that concept of system one and system two. We hopefully you're not sick of me saying the same thing over and over again. According to Professor Kahneman, we have two systems that allows us to process information. The system one is a fast processing system in which you learn one thing and then you don't have to repeat it. Again, this is information that you hopefully have already established in your brain. Think about, for example, the color of your car or the name of your daughter. That's information. Hopefully, again, you don't have to think about it twice. System two is the slower process. It's the one that requires more elaborate answer. It requires more of a different portions of your brain interacting in order for you to get the answer. Try to calculate, for example, the area of a triangle just by having the base and the height. So obviously, you would have to start thinking about that, right? Now, the reality is that we need both systems. We need system one and system two, because as I was saying before, imagine a life in which every single thing that you did, it would require extreme focus and effort. That would be an abuse of system two. Like, imagine that you are going to open the door and then you have to think about how to open the door every single time that you open a door, or you're going to shower. You have to, every single time that you open the soap, you have to learn how to do that, or the body wash, you have to learn how to do that. So obviously it would be impossible. And the problem with system one, or in this case, abusing of the system one, is that it can easily lead to mistakes. Also, it can give us that false sense of security of knowing how to do something. We might stick to an answer even if the answer is not the correct one, or just because we thought of it, it kind of like gives us that sense of security. So there are plenty of reasons why we shouldn't abuse of system one and system two. Now, before I continue, I want to give you a little definition to have a clear understanding of what automatic bias is. Automatic bias, and I'm going to read, is a tendency to depend in excess on automatic thinking. This is your system one, or that I was just discussing before. Now, I'm going to repeat that again. Automatic bias is a tendency to depend in excess in automatic thinking, excuse me. Now, the question is, what does it exactly mean to depend on excess? What is excess? How is it excess? How do you even measure that? As I mentioned before, we'll have built automatic systems to survive, but how much of that is too much? How much of relying on these systems is too much? I think this is when things can get a little bit tricky. An easy way to solve this is by distinguishing what tasks can be automatized and what tasks cannot be automatized or shouldn't automatize because it requires our full attention. For example, having a route to do a particular, to go to your work every single day, that is a good example of system one. You establish a route and then you just go in autopilot. It's a valid form of automatization. This is a valid form of a valid use of automatization. Now, not paying attention to the traffic light because you already have established that pattern and then you know exactly how to get to your office is clearly not a good use of, or it's not a good example of automatization because, you know, the road change every single day. At least the conditions, the weather might be slippery, the traffic lights, or, you know, a possible accident. All of those things make it so you have to pay attention to it, right? There's a similar term, and this is when I'm going to start clarifying between one and the other one, is used as a synonym of automatization bias, and that is the automation bias. And that is a tendency for humans to favor automated decision-making systems and to ignore contradictory information. But even if that is the correct answer, I'm going to repeat this because I know that can be a little bit tricky. Now, automatization bias and automation bias have a lot in common, and that is that reliance on excess on automatic thinking. The only difference between one and the other one is that for automation bias, we make that distinction by saying that is a tendency for humans to favor automated decision-making systems, meaning not only their own, but other automated systems. If someone is telling me certain information, I'm going to rely on that person, right? And in fact, I'm going to tell you a little research, a story about a little research that can actually illustrate that a little bit better. During a research conducted by Dr. Mary, and I'm going to butcher her last name, excuse me, Zindolent, is Dzindolent, and collaborators, participants were asked to detect the presence or absence of camouflage soldiers at a Fort Sill terrain. Fort Sill being a fort, an army fort in this case, and the participants were asked to detect again if they could identify soldiers that were in that terrain being camouflaged. Now, during that research, the participant had automatic aids, meaning they have a system. Could be a computer, it could be their cell phones, that were helping the participants to detect the camouflage soldiers. Initially, the participants relied on and trust the automatic aids, meaning like they relied the computers. They relied on that information. They trusted that information. But what was interesting is little by little, these machines started to make mistakes. And after showing some of these errors, the participants distrusted all the help, including the help of other people that might actually have the correct answers. Even, again, useful information, they would discard it. They were not willing to listen unless that they were given a reason as to why the automatic aid had failed. So again, in order for them to recover their trust, they actually couldn't move on until there was an explanation as to why the machine was failing. The interesting part is that once a reason was given, and again, it could be any reason, it could be actually a complete lie. Once a reason was given, the participants increased their trust on their decision aid, even when the trust was unwarranted, meaning even if the aid was still making mistakes. Now, the participants, and this is a conclusion that I made, so I can tie everything together. The participants could have relied on other cues, other elements, other keys, other things that they could perceive. They could actually do that. Or after realizing that the automatic aid had failed, they could have relied on other people that were trying to help them. But instead, they decided to continue with their trust on the automatic aid. This shows our need to find something that can give us a sense of security. Again, once we find something that can give a potential explanation to what we're seeing, we tend to stick to that, because by removing that, you're removing a sense of understanding of your surroundings. And that's why most people have a hard time at just realizing that they were wrong. Because even if they're deeply inside, they think that they're wrong, chances are that they're still going to have to deal with the fact that they don't understand what's going on. And that is terrifying. So again, in this case of the research, they actually continue to rely because it gave them that sense of security. And also it has to do with the core idea that we have discussed in the past in this series about our anthropological need to look for familiarity. Again, that idea of understanding your surroundings so you don't feel lost, right? So, of course, this behavior can be conducive to some errors, like relying excessively in one thing just because it just gives you a sense of security doesn't mean that you're going to be correct. You're going to be correct. Now, when we talk about the errors that can come from or because of this excessive use of automatic thinking, we talk about specific type of errors. Two common errors are the errors by commission and errors by omission. Errors by commission occur when the person follows what he or she perceives as a reliable explanation. And this is based on the trust the person puts in that source without checking other sources. Meaning, I trust you. I trust what you have to say. So I'm not going to check every single time that you say something. So since I'm relying on that, my first error is to rely not only on what you are saying, because you are the one saying it, by not checking on those systems that make you think that way, right? So those are errors by commission. But there's also an error by omission, and that occurs when the source doesn't register or detect other and often important information. It omits that information, and since the person who relies on the source doesn't check the systems the source employs, it escapes them. That means that first is my mistake. That is the error for commission that we were discussing. My mistake is relying excessively on you because I trust you and not checking on anything that you do. But error by omission is on your behalf, because that is when you err by not paying attention to everything that is around, right? Not every single detail that you have to pay attention to, and reaching the wrong conclusion without actually paying attention to the things that are around you that can corroborate that idea or sometimes actually oppose that idea. So again, let me give you an example. Maybe that's going to be a little bit easier. Imagine that a friend tells you a story, and this is pure gossip. Someone that was doing something, and it might be a third friend that you have. And again, your friend, your main friend who's telling you the story, is telling you the story of how something happened to that other friend. And then the first thing is that you were not there, right? So you rely solely on what that person is going to tell you, and obviously on your friend to tell you the accurate story. Now, solution to this would be to ask other people who were involved in that event, were there, could attest for what happening at the same time, or could tell you a different story. And that would be the first thing, right? So your first error would be to heavily rely on your source. The second mistake comes from your friend's capacity to record that that event, meaning the mistake is, what if your friend, who is now certain of what he heard, for example, was not paying attention to all the words? What if your friend was distracted by other events, only heard certain things, was distracted by someone else talking and could only hear certain words, and then he made that story based on what the words that he can recall hearing. So in this case, there's, as you can see, those two different areas. The one in which you're relying exclusively on your friend on telling you an accurate story, and you not checking on any information that is on your part, on your behalf. But then there's another error occurring because the person who is recording that information and giving that information to you didn't record that information properly. So the first error, again, relying heavily on your friend, that would be an error for commission. And the second error, meaning the error in which your friend is not capturing the information properly and is passing the faulty information to you, that would be an example of an error for omission or by omission. Even if we try to fix some of these errors or even prevent them from happening, we encounter two main problems. The first problem is that most of these happens at an unconscious level. As we always have discussed, problem with biases in general is that they tend to be unconscious. So even if I tell you what to do, probably you're not going to be able to be mindful of that when it happens. We're not aware of it, or at least being aware of it is not it's not a requisite for those errors to happen. That means that the errors can happen even if I'm not aware of them, right? Especially when I'm not aware of them. The second problem that we encounter is that most of these answers or the answers that we obtain, even when there are errors, gives us a sense of security. Again, forget about you realizing that you have relied heavily on someone that you haven't or you shouldn't relied. Or an automated answer that is giving you certain answers, and then you're relying heavily on those answers. Even if you're aware of that and that is bad, you still have to battle with the second problem. The second problem is that, well, that gives you a sense of security, because sometimes an answer is better than no answer, and it gives you that sense of security. So again, as we have discussed at length throughout this series, fighting against that sense of security is something that offers that's something that is very, very hard, because again, it offers you that sense of security. And if you remove that, you have nothing, basically. But how often do we do that? How often do we really question something that we feel that is correct, or that we feel that is true? Or forget about that. How many times do we avoid certain things that makes us feel great, that makes us feel better? So as the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that is also part of the problem. I mean, not the phrase if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm talking about the fact that we rely so heavily on phrases and cliches that makes us feel comfortable. Phrases and cliches that are part of our culture, and we don't normally question them. Remember the phrase that I told you in the beginning, the Occam's razor? Given the same circumstances, the most plausible explanation tends to be the correct one. As I said then, this is a simple or a way to simplify things. And it might be a useful way to deal with certain decisions, right? Because it kind of facilitates the process of having to make a decision. Because all of a sudden you have this cliche that tells you, oh, if all the circumstances are given are equally the same, so the most plausible explanation tends to be the correct one. Especially when we are overwhelmed with a lot of choices, or we have to decide quickly. So there's a problem, though. I did not say such thing. I said the simplest answer is usually the correct one. And that should be a metaphor for all this topic. Our focus is constantly changing from one task to another, especially now that we are, bombarded, if you will, by so much information every single day, making it increasingly hard at paying the right type of attention, the right amount of attention to the things that require attention. We can go on and on about how social media has played an important role in worsening this phenomenon. That will be discussed in a different video, but for today's video, I think it is more important to focus on the relationship between focus and that automatization or automation thinking, or automatic, thinking. So far, I have made these 3 videos featuring focus and how it might promote certain biases. There are more. There is definitely way more than those videos, but I wanted to offer some solutions since the most common mistakes are commission and by omission. Remember those in which one is the problem on relying heavily in the source, and the other one is on the source itself of not paying the right attention, the right amount of attention before giving you an answer. Let's address them individually. In the case of errors by commission, it would be a good idea to stop and think, do I know all the information that is needed in order for me to understand the problem and to recognize a possible solution? So I always say, am I capacitated? Am I capable of understanding the problem? Or is there any other information that I need? And even if the answer is yes, even if you're saying like, well, I'm confident of what I believe in, ask yourself the following question. Is there anything else that I have not considered yet? Other people's opinions, other information that could be useful, anything at all? Is there anything else to consider that would be hopefully clarifying, some things, or at least will make you think about other possibilities that you didn't encounter or you haven't thought about them before, right? So again, this is just a way for you to stop any further into your safety and to, before you establish that level of safety or security on something that you believe, is like, okay, let me stop. Do I have all the information? Is there anything else that I need? What happens with mistakes by omission? You can continue with the same line of questions. In fact, I would actually start with this type of questions, type of questions or line of questions that I just told you before approaching the mistakes by omission. In this case, is a very similar question, but now we're going to transform into a positive manner. Instead of asking yourself if there's anything else I have not considered yet, you can ask yourself with other things, or what other things I should be looking at. So again, this is not, am I making a mistake because I haven't considered something yet, which will put you already in a defensive mode. You can immediately go into the opposite and say, all right, what other things could I consider? There are other things that I should be looking at. Now, there's also one important skill that can help people, and this has to do with System 1 and System 2 and how to rely on one system or the other one. So let's say that you have a steak in front of you. This is a silly example that probably is going to help you. You're in a rush and you want to eat because you have to leave soon. The first thing that you see is a spoon. Again, you're just rushing, and then you just see a spoon, and then you decided to go for it since you are in such rush. You start pressing the steak with your spoon, you start like crushing it, and then you put even a little bit of that into your mouth. You try to chew, but 5 minutes after, you're just like, all right, I'm done. You just chew a little bit, and that's all you could do, right? Of course, you could have taken that amount of time to search for a knife and a fork, and because of the pressure that you felt, that idea or the idea of having the urgency to leave made you to continue or made you kind of continue pursuing the same silly route that you were going to, again, just trying to eat with a spoon, a steak with a spoon, um, instead of just thinking that that is a terrible choice. That is just because it gave you a momentary sense of comfort. You know, that comfort of knowing that at least a spoon is something that you normally use to eat. Of course, there are places where spoons is all you need. The same way that there are moments in which System 1 is a utensil that you need to use. Think about, for example, escaping a threat. Obviously, if you are being, I don't know, chased by someone, you're not going to just think about 10 ways to escape and then just Google or just to YouTube a tutorial where you're being prosecuted, followed by someone. You probably will be better off just by calling 911 or calling the police or calling for someone's help. Again, those are examples in which System 1 is a much, much better solution. Distinguishing between both systems is crucial. Again, both systems, System 1, System 2, you have to be able to understand when you have to use one and when you have to use the other one. As I mentioned before, factors such as stress might create that sense of urgency that will lead to the feeling that you need to use the System 1. Stress can actually cloud everything that you're going to do. It's not only about System 1 and System 2, even if you're in System 2, can actually alter the way that you think. Now, unfortunately, that is something that most of us experience every single day, like not making that distinction between System 1 and System 2. You might have the sense that you have to run to give an answer, or once you have that answer, that the answer must be the correct one because you have or you took the time to think about it. By the way, remember that idea that, remember the Occam's razor, the simplest answer is usually the correct one. No, in this case, I'm not tricking you. Actually, I'm just telling you what I just said in the beginning. Well, it turns out that that is actually not even what William of Ockham said, the 14th century philosopher that actually coined that phrase. He actually said entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. Authors have quoted him, adding some things and transforming his message throughout centuries. The reason why the phrase, the simplest answer tends to be the correct one, is so familiar is because versions of this phrase have been repeated over and over again in media, in movies, in TV shows. It sounds familiar to us because, again, we rely to what is familiar to us. And if you have watched this phrase or some iteration of that phrase on TV and movies over and over again, or you have even heard other people saying the phrase without checking if that is what the author truly said, you're probably going to believe that that is what the phrase is supposed to be, right? The correct way of the phrase. Moreover, we don't even question the validity of the phrase. We don't actually stop and think if that is actually the correct one, since it sounds familiar and the meaning of the phrase makes our life a little bit easier. Again, errors by commission or errors for commission and errors for omission. So as you can see, there are plenty of things that we can say, but mostly in this case, this is not about what you're focusing. It's more of the lack of focus or how to rely heavily on the first answers, on the System 1. That is what the automatic thinking is all about. In this case, the problem or the main problem that we have is that attached to that idea of automatic thinking is that idea that I thought of something, that I made an effort, even if it's not a huge effort, even if it's something that came to my head. And that also gave me a sense of security. So that is why it's so difficult for us to try to cut certain ideas out of our lives, or to try to go against certain ideas that we already have in our heads, because again, it kind of is fighting against our sense of security and our sense of familiarity with our surroundings. So as always, think about ways in which you can improve that into your lives. And again, this is not for you to, it's not a tool for you to use on anybody, although it could be useful, but this is more a tool for self-reflection. So as usual, thank you so much for watching this video. Next, I will be talking about attentional bias, or how when we have to make an important decision, our attention focuses on certain possibilities and not others. As usual, thank you so much again for watching this video. I hope that this is useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.